So let's start out by adding the Remember Me checkbox to our login form, and that way we can see how to set up that Remember Me box as well as capture that data in our view model for Postback. So in my view, we'll right click here and say go to view. That'll jump us into our view. What I've done here is I've added a label called Remember Me, and then I've added an input type of checkbox with a value of true and the name Remember Me, and then a line break. So now we'll have an additional checkbox showing up underneath our username and password boxes. Then in my login user view model, I went ahead and added a public bool of Remember Me. So just adding that boolean that will capture that checkbox postback data. So now if we run this, we will end up with an additional checkbox in our view. So there's our username, password, and our Remember Me checkbox. So we'll go ahead and log in. Now this time I'll check the box and I'll click Login. And before I do that, let me make sure I have a breakpoint in place. I do. So I'll go ahead and hit Login. So now if in debug mode, I can mouse over my variable login user and expand it, and I can see my three properties: password, Remember Me, which is set to true, and username, which is set to Kevin1. So this data now is making it from our view into our view model. So we'll go ahead and just hit continue here, and then it'll say, hello Kevin, welcome to our application. We can modify this output string if we want. And we could then say something like, let's put up, oh, I'm still in debug mode, so let's stop that. Take this breakpoint off. We can have a little bit of fun here real fast. So let's take this string and cut it out. We'll say string message equals, and we can say if login user dot remember me. We can say message plus equals I will always remember you. Else, we'll just leave it. We won't do an else. And now we can output our message as content. So now if we run it again, now remember we made changes to the controller, so we have to make sure we do that rebuild and rerun. Otherwise those changes don't get picked up. So we'll go ahead and go back to our login again. So now we'll log in again. Check the box and we'll hit login. It says, hello Kevin1, welcome to our application. I will always remember you. And if I uncheck the box and then hit login again, we don't get the I will always remember you. So we're using some of that logic to control how we're then handling the application on the back end. Alright, so we've got our basics of our controller, login controller in place, but let's actually put some functionality to it so it actually works and, does something. So to do that, we're going to start off by, I'm going to go ahead and close my view. I'm going to close my view model. And I'll just need my account controller. I'm going to hide this properties dialog because we're not going to really need that. And then I'm going to go into my web config. Now your web config has a lot of different configuration settings for your apps, and we need to actually add an additional configuration option so that we can enable authentication. So to do that, we're going to go underneath the section called system.web. And underneath system.web, we're going to do authentication. And you'll see here that there's a lot of different attributes that we can add. We're going to add the mode, and we're going to set this mode to forms-based authentication. So we'll close that element, and then we're going to add a child element underneath, and this will be the forms element. And in here, there's a whole slew of different things we can add. Our default URL for now will be tilde slash. And then our login URL will be tilde/account/login. And I'll talk more about what the tilde means in just a second. The name we can leave the same. Let's see, everything else here actually we can leave. And then underneath here, we can add credentials if we want to keep credentials inside of the web config, but in the next lecture set, we're going to go ahead and actually move those credentials into the database. So we'll worry about handling them then that way. All right, so back that out. And from this point, we can go ahead and we've kind of set up the basics that we need for our authentication. So we'll jump back into our controller. Now, when we first kind of worked to flush this out, we had kind of just some play data. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just delete that code. And then I had worked last week to put in some comments about validation, database connections. So let's start to fill some of this in. We're not going to do all of it this week. We're still going to kind of just treat it as dummy data, but let's go ahead and kind of make some strides to make this functional. So let's start with the validation. So we'll say things like if login user equals null. And then what we can do is we can say model state dot add model error, and this error will just have an empty string for the key, comma, and then there's a second overload that takes a string message, and we'll say login is required, and then we'll simply return the view. The second check we'll make is if string dot is null or white space, which is a static function off of the string class, and this basically says is this string null or white space, and we'll check is login user.username null or white space. If so, we'll say model state.add model error, username is required, return view. And then the third time, string is null or white space, login user.password, and then we'll do model state add model error, password is required, and then return the view. Now, the reason we return the view each time is because we want to go back to that page and then present that error. Now, in order for the error to be shown, we need to actually carve that out into our view, and we'll do that in just a moment. So we've now done the validation. Make sure that we actually have a username and password. We're not going to worry about the database connection or hashing the password right now or querying. Now actually we're not even going to worry about validating at this point. So let's just assume that the username and password that we received is valid. So we need to actually authenticate the user and persist that in some kind of way. Now to do that, we are going to use a class under system.web.security.forms authentication is the class. This class contains a whole series of static methods that helps us to go through the process of authenticating a user within ASP.NET and actually storing their credentials in a cookie that ASP.NET will then manage for us. All right, so what we are looking for is a method called setAuthCookie. And what this will do is it will actually store or create an authentication cookie for our user. So we'll call setAuthCookie and we'll pass in login user.username. And then we have this boolean that says create persistent cookie. A persistent cookie means that, well, I should say when a cookie is not persistent, then when the user closes their browser, then that user session gets forgotten. So the web server no longer knows that that user is logged in and that cookie disappears. If the session is persisted, then after the user closes the browser, they log off the computer, they do any of those things, when they come back the next time, the system remembers who they are and they're still logged in, and that cookie, that authentication, still persists. So this will be where our remember me comes into play. So if the remember me is selected or checked, then that's true, and that's a Boolean value. So then we'll just pass that in as should we persist. All right. And then the last step will be for us to actually perform that redirect. So here we're going to say return redirect, and then we can go back to our forms authentication utility class, and what I'm going to do here is I need to add that using statement. So I'm going to add the using statement here, and then I can simply do dot get redirect URL. And get redirect URL actually does the same thing. It requires that login user, username, and login user dot remember me. So we'll go ahead and use that. And that will redirect the user back to the appropriate place, be it the default page, or if they were visiting another page when they got here, then we can capture that data and actually redirect them to the appropriate place as well. So we've got all of that in place now. So now we basically have set up authentication for our user. Now we need to handle our errors and make sure that we have the right data being presented. So I'm going to jump into my view by right-clicking and saying go to view. Underneath this h2 tag, I'm going to go at, and then I'm going to use HTML, which is my helper, which is built into the view, dot, and I'm going to call for the validation summary. And what this function is going to do for us is it will actually generate HTML markup if there are model errors in our model state that we modified on the controller side. So every time we call this add model error, when this view renders, it will check that, and then this validate summary will actually project out those error messages onto the screen. So that way that the user can see, hey, you forgot to put in a username and password, or you're missing a username, or you're missing a password. So we'll see all of that show up there. All right, so we rerun our app and we pop up into our login page. So I'm going to actually leave the page blank and I'm just going to click login. And we get an error saying the username is required. So I'll put in my username, but I'll forget my password. I'll hit login, and now a password is required. So I'll have to put in my username again and my password. And then I'll click login. Now what's going to happen here is it should redirect me back to the home page. So we are now authenticated into our system. Now there's nothing that's visually telling us that, so in later lectures we'll work on modifying this underscore layout so that it can actually say, hi Kevin, or welcome user, into the context of our web page.